This interview was conducted on December 5th, 2018 in Charleston at Trident Technical College. This was an opportunity for Herb Frazier to reflect on his earlier experience as a black journalist, why media sees black males as dangerous and criminals, the stereotypes in the media, the night of Emmanuel AME Church shooting, and his book, We Are Charleston.
Hey everyone, I'm Jaleesa Paintney, and today we have a special guest. He's a public relations director at Magnolia Plantation and Garden. He's also an author and journalist. Mr. Herb Frazier, how are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm
Thanks
doing
for having me here
good.
today.
You're welcome. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. You were the first African-American reporter working for the daily newspaper. What was it like working there?
Well, I wouldn't say I was the first black reporter.
Well, if you wasn't
working
the
for
first, do you know anybody who were the first?
Well, when I joined the staff at the then News and Courier in 1972, Rudy Pyatt was a reporter, the first black reporter at the News and Courier, which is now the Post and Courier here in Charleston. And Rudy left and went on to the Washington Post, where I think he worked on the business staff. And there was another young lady who worked at the News and Courier. And then there was a reporter at the Evening Post. There was an afternoon paper at here in Charleston called the Evening Post. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name right now, but he's still alive and lives here in Somerville. But throughout my newspaper career, maybe up until maybe the 1980s, I was maybe one of three, less than five African-American reporters on the staff, because at that time there weren't that many black people in journalism in South Carolina. Now, when you go to the larger newspapers in the Midwest and the North and the West, the numbers tended to increase. But here in South Carolina, there weren't that many that worked for the daily newspapers.
Being an African-American male journalist, what was your experience like?
Well, it was difficult at times, and as I mentioned to you earlier, like most young people, maybe like yourself, you're very impatient when you're young. And things are not going to happen as fast as you want them to happen. And I was very impatient. It's at some point in your life, you realize that you have to A, pay your dues, B, you have to learn the fundamentals of the craft, and three, you have to overcome maybe any kind of self-doubt that you might have. We're all plagued by self-doubt, and you have to be comfortable with yourself, not only in the writing process, because writing is a very lonely exercise. And particularly if you're writing for a daily newspaper, or you're writing a manuscript, you're writing for a book, or you're writing for a magazine, and even broadcast journalism, you want to get it right. Being first is not necessarily that important. You want to be right and accurate, and you want to put your best product forward to educate the public, to entertain the public, to inform the public. So as a black journalist, and then particularly a black journalist in the South, sometimes you come across people of a different race who don't appreciate you. And I have a few stories in which I have been called the N-word, but it is not necessarily how you react, that is important. It's how you, you're not going to necessarily get angry because I'm the reporter. I'm the guy who works for the company that buys the newspaper print by the ton and ink by the gallon, so I can get the last word. Although you try to be as objective as you can also put people maybe not in the best light by asking them tough questions. If they don't want to be friendly with you, you don't necessarily have to be friendly to them.
In one of your interviews, you said that black people couldn't get in newspapers unless it was a crime. Why do you think media see black men as dangerous or criminals?
Well, that goes back to what I said earlier about the staffs. If the staffs are all white, right? And they don't, sometimes it's not necessarily that they're biased, they just don't know, because they have not lived the black experience in America. So in the absence of not knowing, they don't have an appreciation of the culture or the neighborhood where we live. And they have these perceptions, these stereotypes. We're basically the same people. But if you're not able to push aside these stereotypes, you make erroneous assumptions about people that are not always right. So if you've not been in that situation, you've not educated, you've not been informed about what it is to be black in America or a black man in Charleston, you're going to be pulled along by these stereotypes that are out there. How
can media break these stereotypes?
Well, by just honest reporting. I just sometimes I recoil still when I pick up the newspaper and I only see black faces when it comes to crime and sports. We're in all sectors of society. We're in government, we're in business, we're in medicine, we're in education. And you don't necessarily have to report or identify that person as an African American and say, this is what she said or he said. You just put that person in that role, in a role that could be in a role that a white person has. I mean, we're everywhere in society. We've done everything. We've done some great things, and those things need to be put out there so people see that we're not pigeonholed into these stereotypical roles that some white people want to place you in.
On June 17, 2015, where were you and what was that night of experience was like?
Well, I'll never forget that moment. It was about 10 o'clock that night when my daughter called me and said, Daddy, there'd been a shooting at your church, because as I told you earlier, I spent the first 14 years of my life in Charleston living in the Anson Borough homes on the east end of Calhoun Street, and I was a member of Mother Emanuel. And my daughter still associates with me not only with that part of Charleston, but also the church. So she called me and she said, Daddy, there'd been a shooting at your church. And I said, what do you mean, shooting at the church? I knew exactly what she meant. And I was thinking maybe there'd been a shooting outside. But when we turned on the television, Channel 5, and was watching your friend, Listervelt, report live from the corner of Meeting, he was at the corner of Calhoun and Meeting Street, we realized something serious had happened to Mother Emanuel. And so my wife and I, we got in the car, we were living on James Island, we came across the connector, got onto the peninsula, was coming down Calhoun Street, and we could see the flashing red lights and blue lights in the distance. And we were listening on the radio, and we knew something had been seriously had happened, and we saw the helicopter circling around, and they mentioned on the radio that the shooter had not been apprehended. And so we thought maybe it's best that we leave and go back home, and we watched until late that night, watching things develop, and got the news of the victims. And of course, like all of us, we were all stunned and saddened by that, because I knew one of the people, Cynthia Hurd, who was a librarian. She had participated in a program we had at Magnolia, and I'd met Reverend Pinckney before. So it was like, it was a very tragic event. It stunned us, stunned the nation, stunned the world, really.
Your book, We Are Charleston, what emotions were you feeling while writing your book?
That's a very good question. As a journalist, you have to suppress your emotions. We participated in some of the marches and attended some of the prayer vigils. And I remember, shedding tears as I marched with others past Emanuel on Calhoun Street. But after, we got that assignment to do the book, you push your emotions aside and you focused on the task at hand, and you tried to interview as many people as you could and collect as much information and history as you could, and put it, do the best writing job that you could in the relatively short period of time we had.
Well, thank you, Mr. Frazier, for taking the time out and doing this interview.
You're welcome.